Michael Young at Goldsmiths College.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I've given myself, I've layered myself with quite an elaborate title here. I think what I'd really like to talk about is the challenges that particular kinds of music making, which are so prevalent today in the interactive works that we call interactive or generative, the challenges they present, if you like, from an analytic perspective. And when you and I were talking about the content of this talk, you raised the word poiesis. You said, no, this is about aesthesis. So I'm afraid I am going to talk about poiesis, because I think it's the challenge between, if you like, the tension between these two concepts, which were established obviously by Nassier with respect to composed music, which is so problematic, I think, in this field and so interesting. My interest very much comes from, as a composer and a creator of systems for interactive music making, rather than an analyst in a sense. I co-founded with Tim Blackwell at Goldsmiths the Live Algorithms Music Research Network a few years ago, which is sort of resurfaced under the more poetic title Songs for Dynamical Systems by some students of ours. In fact, there's an event in Leeds, a concert and symposium in April, following on that research, which, as it says there, was really looking at the idea of how human musicians could play with artificial musicians. And that idea has influenced my work a great deal, going back a few years. A list of works there, Trio for Two Players, as a title I hope kind of sums up the thinking in a little way. And I'm working on a new piece for live scores based on the same idea. I thought maybe I might just play you a couple of minutes of a oboe prosthesis, just to give you a flavour of what that music, what the sound world is. I can do this. How loud it's going to be. Very quiet. Can we change that? Oh dear. Okay, I think we'll report that. I think that isn't going to work. Okay, all right, skip that. I'll pull that out. Let me go back. My starting point, the point I wanted to make with that example, had I played it, was that it's constructed with a very particular kind of approach to the idea of machine learning, machine listening, machine response. And the question is, and also based on the idea of improvisation, so the whole piece, all these pieces, prosthesis pieces as I call them, are based on the idea of improvisation rather than anything notated. And the question that interests me is how far any of those processes might be perceivable, and in what category of perception, musical, imaginative, etc., perception, are they perceivable if they are. So in preparing this talk, I thought maybe go back, wheel out the big guns, as it were, the analysts, and I looked at some of Brahms' writings, who reminds us that, as he points out, a good analytical theory models those experiential dynamics, the dynamics of musical experience, which he argues is very difficult to do. Whereas, apparently, compositional theory for him is much simpler and needs only focus on what's practical use in terms of application. Which I suppose is another way of articulating this idea of aesthetic and poetic. Whereas David Lowen is perhaps more subtly reminding us that perception cannot fully account for music if we think of music as a performative act, something you do, not something just that one perceives. So there is perhaps a tension in view there between how far we prioritise the idea of perception over an understanding of, if you like, intention and design. The term prosthesis I was using for those pieces, oboe prosthesis, flute prosthesis, which Jos Sternberg played just last night, in fact. The idea of the prosthesis came from images from this German expressionist film Orlak's Hand, which is a kind of beginning of a familiar horror film motif where the hapless victim, in this case Orlak, a pianist, loses his hands in a tragic accident, and an experimental surgeon replaces the hands with those from a deceased person, and everything appears to be fine. They're prosthetics. If you like, his identity subsumes these hands and is back to the keyboard. But unbeknownst to him, the hands actually were taken from an executed murderer. Yes. So therein lies, I think he's beginning to realise this at this point in the film. And the hands, not so much that the hands are, I mean, that's perhaps not the most interesting aspect of the fact that it's a murderer. The fact is, it's another identity which is associated with these apparent prosthetic objects. So his relationship to these, if you like, objects with which he can interact as if they were his own, actually he can't. He cannot fully interact with them because they are asserting a separate identity. And this obviously forms the way the story develops. I think this character Alice, I think her name is. Here we have, for me, a sort of visualization, if you like, of this tension between aesthesis and prosthesis, and poetic dimensions. We have the hapless heroine. She obviously thinks she for us as the audience. There's this very clear expectation that something's going to happen, and it looks like she's expecting something nice is going to happen. Okay, and we have the Orlak himself. We have the intentional character, and we have interposing between apparently another emerging set of intentions, which are going to disrupt that aesthetic experience, possibly quite unpleasantly. So in that image, there's a certain tension which I think is inherent in interactive music. Okay, so my talk's in 3 parts now. So I'd argue that there are problems, if you like, and challenges, which I'd just like to sort of discuss in a very general way, if I may. In music with no poetic level, apparently. Music apparently with too many, whether they're real or imaginary. And music which has both too many and not enough. Okay. Now, interactive and generative music is clearly, and it's a vast field, and I couldn't do justice to it I couldn't do justice to it in a day, or let alone 40 minutes. But arguably what this vast kind of breadth of music has in common is a certain aspect of music making which we might use the word performativity to describe. So we can interpret performativity in the more familiar sense of acting to cause effects, in the more traditional sense of understanding performance. So interactive music could be conceived as a form of performance, in which the music becomes through the act of doing. But we could also argue that generative music, algorithmic music and so on, is performative in the sense, in a more generalized sense, maybe thinking of the way Judith Butler in her writings on gender theory describes performativity, that it's an identity is formed through a series of actions, that identity, gender for her isn't something you just have, it's not something you're born with simply, it's something you act out and formulate during the course of your whole life. And so this meaning is formed through every action that you perform, everything you say, everything you do. So we could regard that maybe generative music is in a constant state of becoming, and so it's performative in that sense. So for me, you could argue perhaps that there's a kind of linking concept there, which is a way of helping address these two areas of music together. So, music where there apparently is no poetic level, generative music. Its attributes are, as I'm sure are familiar, the idea of applying some form of algorithmic process. And a condition of that might be that the algorithmic process is not interfered with. There's very little intervention while the algorithm runs. And that's a principal definition of the Turing algorithm, that it runs till it's complete. Obviously, there are lots of examples of generative music where that may not be the case, either in the process of the moment of creation before it's heard or during it's heard. But there's a principle of algorithms being applied. Multiplicity in the sense that generative music, an important characteristic, is you press a button and you get a product, and potentially every time you press that button you get a different product. The algorithm, depending on what's running, isn't necessarily going to produce the same results every time. It's that idea of multiplicity. So that raises an interesting question about what the work actually is. if it's not one particular instance of a realization. Temporality, I suppose, is a result of that. I know Nick Collins uses the term infinite length pieces, pieces which have no reason for finishing. There's nothing innate, there's no pre-programmed or intended reason why the music should stop. The process is not necessarily complete at any point. So quite a different relationship between the idea of structure in time, Xenakis' idea of en temps, structures sort of working their way through time as opposed to en temps outside of time. And of course the problem with pieces which are of infinite length, the conception of even an outside of time is problematic, arguably. Okay, so in generative music, we could possibly say there are two basic subcategories, principles that inform those attributes. There are types which are modelled on music, and the types which are not. So the types modelled on music, we might look to examples where some kind of knowledge base, some theoretical understanding of music has been encoded in some form, such as the chorale system, an early version expert system which could harmonise Bach chorales very convincingly. We might even look to more recent things like Francois Pachet's work with the bebop improvising system, which, however phenomenally informed it is in terms of AI, it is actually encoding a lot of his understanding of jazz in terms of harmony, the way that jazz is phrased and structured. So some kind of encoding a knowledge base, presumably from the designer. Then of course we have sub-symbolic artificial intelligence, modelling without respect to the idea of expert systems or rules, etc. Markov modelling is the most kind of cited type of sub-symbolic AI in music. And a very good example, again, is Francois Pachet's The Continuator. I don't know whether you've come across that. Which is a marvellous system for an improviser and disclavier, whereby you sit at the piano playing the disclavier, and in literally seconds, a Markov model will be formulated on the fly, sufficiently powerful enough for the machine to carry on in the same style that you've initiated. And there's some very good footage on YouTube of Bernard Lubar improvising with this system, where he sets up a walking bass and a right hand, and within a few seconds, the system has modelled that such that you can still hear the bifurcation of the texture. You can see it appears to have learned something immediately about jazz. Because it hasn't really, it's modelled exactly the surface of what he's played. But nevertheless, the generative principle is modelled on the idea of the actual corpus of material, whether it's live or it's found from another source. So the other type, not modelled on music, abstract formulations, thinking of Pressing's work on non-linear systems, data obtained from another source, any source, are familiar with the idea of sonification of data and then reused in some way. Reappropriating models that describe the world, which is almost a romantic Goethe-esque notion of from nature comes organisation. And there are many examples in the work I've undertaken with Tim Blackwell, his work on swarms, where we model how termites and ants and flocks of geese, if you like, organise themselves apparently into systems of outwardly appearing structured behaviour. And then taking those kind of ideas of structure and applying them, somehow feeding them into the world of musical sound. So that's those two basic categories. We have the issue of intention, whether it's there or not with this music. Who has the attention and where is it? And Solowitz's famous, often quoted line, the idea becomes a machine that makes the art, rather than the idea makes the art, is to suggest that there is this discontinuity between intention and the result in a very clear way. And we could harken back to Searle's idea of original intentionality, which is the Chinese room argument, his argument against the Turing test and how that could ever be borne out in reality. The idea of original intentionality is that which we think. If you write it down, the sentence doesn't have intentionality. The sentence is derivative of your intentionality. So we could make a case that generative music, if you like, is loosely derivative in that sense, that it embodies some kind of intention. And that intention is merely displaced further and further away from if you like, from the viewpoint of the listener. In a composed piece of music, that somehow the music embodies the composer's intention. In generative music, we have a designer who's instigated some software, who's created a machine that's created the art, and we're sort of extrapolating back, possibly just in our imagination. Of course, that doesn't answer the question of generative systems which are not deterministic, where we don't necessarily know what the result is going to be, where, as in swarm particle theory or not chaos theory, but maybe a cellular automata, where the state of the machine at any particular moment can't be predicted. It's emergent behaviour. So how can we say that's derivative from the original intention? It's a problem. We could, though, apply analysis that might infer design ideas quite reasonably. Zygovsky's work on, I think I misspelled there, sorry, on his book Conceptualizing Music applies a sort of standard, if you like, harmonic motivic analysis after running the musical dice game attributed to Mozart several times, I think 11 times. I don't know whether you're familiar with that. It's an 18th century sort of parlour game, really, where you have a whole series of bars of music taken in isolation. You have a dice, and you have a list of numbers telling you how to interpret the dice instructions. And however you throw the dice, you will get a apparently convincing minuet every time. And every time it's different. So it's back to this idea of multiplicity. But he points out very convincingly that through the analysis of many, many iterations of that algorithm, that there are basic musical knowledge encoded into that system, that no matter, the choices are restricted in such a way that the first chord will always be the tonic, the second chord will always be the subdominant, etc., etc. We will always have a cadence in the right place. And so there are restrictions which are in fact a design basis for that work, which we can infer from any realization. There might be also, we could take that a bit further, and we could look at work like David Cope's work on, with Ellie, the composing artificial intelligence system. And some of his earlier work focused on the idea of teaching a machine to impersonate particular styles, and specific composers, Scarlatti, Mozart, and others. And we could, of course, we could look to analytical models from to sort of assess the efficacy of that approach. And so, if you like, we're extrapolating, we're imagining it really is Scarlatti, not David Cope or his system, and how far does it convince us of that fact? And I suppose we could, through analysis, also be interested in the design ethos, the history of the designing context. What's this? What can we infer from this work that tells us something about the history of, for instance, the application of a particular generative process in a context? What's possibly worth remembering, though, is this, as Ron points out, is that the musical perception is what we're modelling in analysis, and to some extent, analysis is not to decode what the structure was. Is the purpose of analysis simply to reverse engineer, if we wished, the work that was made? And that certainly is an approach to considering such music as this. And we could talk about the black box where we don't know what's going on. We could talk about the white box where we do know what's going on, and we can simply look at how it's being realised. Or we could perhaps we could more commonly think about a grey box where we have an idea of the principle that's informed a certain system, we're not quite sure how it's working. An example might be Karl-Heinz Essel's Lexicon Sonata, which is a MIDI generating system, which can be used in a pure generative mode. It's basically statistical. It has, if you're familiar with Max, you might well have come across Essel's work in this. Lots of objects in Max which can produce all kinds of interesting statistical probability functions, and then you can sonify them basically as note events. Now we could imagine that any particular instance of the Lexicon Sonata played out, we might be able to do a histogram and make some kind of assertions about, well, what kind of probability function appears to be emerging. If we had enough data, if we didn't have enough data, we wouldn't. So in theory, we could imagine we would be able to derive something from that. A basic knowledge of the system would lead us to make certain conclusions about how it was functioning. What's interesting about such approaches, though, I mean, very explicitly in with the idea of reverse engineering, is that analysis appears to be something which is actually symmetrical with creation, directly, that analysis creates. So the histogram which we might derive from, say, an iteration of the Lexicon Sonata could very easily just be, we could just turn it around and use it as the probability function to make more of the same. The analysis literally becomes the tool for creation. And you can see that also in the continuator system. The Markov model is the analysis, in some sense, of what was played. It's also the means by which we can then generate more of the same. So I was wondering whether we should, taking Rahm very much literally, whether we have to say, in fact, no, we're not reverse engineering. The only useful analysis of this kind of music is almost analysis which willfully ignores the means of production. That it's completely alienated from the source. Otherwise, what are we really learning about it? Okay. So we can infer intentionality if we want. So here's a sort of parody of Soloway's. Machines evoke ideas that we think are art, not ideas make machines that make art. Okay. If I could move on to interactive music, music with too many poetic levels rather than not enough. And again, we could think about two categories here, arguably. One is sort of very deterministic interactive music. I'm thinking of the world of what's we call live electronics, the world of composed music, which it has an interactive aspect. Think of Boulez's Entendre for violin and live electronics. That's the kind of domain. Electroacoustic music goes live, if you like, in which the liveness is essentially interpretative, and liveness is essentially based on the idea of procedural efficacy. Arguably, you could make a tape of the electronic part of Entendre, and a good player could just play along to it. Yeah. There's no reason for it innately to have this interactive aspect, arguably. So putting it more positively, the interactions are, if you like, in a transformational relationships of material between the live sound and the electronic sound. Okay. So analysis, taking that into account, could be applying whatever analytical methods we apply to composed electroacoustic or notated music. The challenge maybe is to find a way of addressing the boundaries across those kinds of approaches between the electronic and, if you like, the traditional. We had a PhD student, Alessandro Cicleri, a few years ago, completed successfully a PhD where he took the theory of Schaeffer's theory of objets sonores and he applied it in analysis of pitch structures in Griset's music. So it was a deliberate transference of a theory derived from one source into a way of understanding afresh the way in which a particular form of spectral music had been created. So maybe the challenge there is to how far we can sort of find links between those different perspectives. And one obvious starting point, if we're looking for automated tools to do that, is that think of, say, Lichtbergen, where there's all these very subtle, nuanced transformations of familiar instrumental sounds, flute sounds, and so on. If we knew what the flute sound was by default, we could say how far has this treated flute sound deviated from what we expect. And we have a kind of continuum there then, which maybe we could find a way of articulating in analytical terms about the inherent transformational nature of the relationships. So we're looking very much at the material as notated and as heard. Interactive music, thinking which is not deterministic, is that which we increasingly recognise as truly interactive music, arguably, where often with technology, improvised music, a performance practice which is not about interpretation but much more about contingency, ideas forming on the fly, and so on. And the issues at hand very often there are to do with design of instruments, the World of Nine, the conference, and therefore mapping performative acts through design devices into computers that make sound, that whole vast domain of parameter mapping. Interactions are all the things above, arguably, but also performative acts which are about how do you translate an intention, how do you learn to use a machine, what are we actually doing as a performance. A lot of these theories which describe that kind of process are actually, I think, are reinterpreting and reapplying a well-established model in educational theory. I think David Cobb was the first to publish on it, of the experiential learning cycle, which I've kind of given a sort of draft version of there, where this is a way of trying to articulate how anyone learns anything at any stage in their development, and therefore, arguably, is how a performer might learn, or a user, maybe is a better word, might learn to apply a device in the making of music. So we have a concrete experience, we hear a sound, we reflect, we make observations, we reflect on that. That allows us to try and conceptualize about the sound, in this case, and then we experiment to test that theory. And then we again learn from that. So if I was working with some kind of video analysis, and I did this, and I got a string sound, I might therefore be able to immediately make conclusions about the relationship of that gesture to that sound and experiment accordingly. Okay. One of my favourite examples of this approach is the Michel Weiswitz's hand system. I don't know whether you're familiar with these very intricate glove-like objects. Back to the hands, aren't we? Glove-like objects, which have a kind of prosthetic relationship to his own body. And when I saw him in performance, you were so far away you couldn't really see the hands, italics, the machine. You could see him as a performer, very much on the left there, looking like a performer in the right kind of dress. And so it's all that kind of performative aspect of presentation. But presentation is a bit of a problem in this area. A lot of analysis and evaluation of interactive music in this sense, improvised music which is generated on the fly, which involves learning on the fly maybe even, a lot of it is really just from the perspective of the participants, the people who are doing the learning, or people who are doing the things on the fly. Group experience, participants' experience, the collaborative process, theories about how we can instigate, respond, learn from each other, maybe in group setting, unlike Michel Weiswitz's work, where more than one person's involved. I'm thinking of work that Nick Brian King's done a lot of very interesting work on what he calls mutual engagement in a group setting, where there's interactive processes at work. And he uses discourse analysis, which is a way of replaying the music that was made and actually invites people to talk over it, rather like a DVD commentary, but in a much more structured and rigorous way, where the participants can reflect in a structured way on what they did and why during this process. That's one example. So obviously very much thinking, retrospective verbal protocol is another type of that approach. Very much focusing on what the participants felt their experience was. I suppose another aspect of this, back to Weiswitz again, the instrumental idea, is a lot of the debates there, the evaluation is about the efficacy of the device, the idea of intimacy, is a term coined by Moore in that very famous, often cited article, The Dysfunctions of MIDI, is it? He talks about control intimacy, and it's that idea of sensitivity and synchronicity, and it doesn't use the word prosthetic, but it's kind of hinting in that direction. He's talking about the kind of relationship any player should have with their instrument, I guess. And how intimate that relationship is kind of, in work of Fells, Sidney Fells and others, is it seen as a value measure for interactive systems. The more intimate, the better the instrument. Therefore, arguably, the more expressive it is, therefore, arguably, the better the music is. But what about the listener's perspective, the aesthetic perspective, if you like? It's quite a problem because we have so many identities at hand. We have the designer of the object, we have, as in the hands, we have possibly a live instrument which is more familiar, a flute or an oboe. We have all these kind of relationships of objects in that sense. We have networks of relationships between objects in a musical sense, of materials and transformations of materials. And we have actors, we have the idea of, well, who's instigating what's actually happening. In the beginning of L'Entendeur, we hear the violin, we then hear a very assertive gesture in the electronics. Now, where did that come from? Are we being invited to consider that as a separate identity, as an actor in this scenario, or is it somehow linked explicitly to the violin or not? Problematic. You could say it's almost verging on alienation. Because if I got my video tracker, imaginary video tracker, and I do this, and I get a nice bowing sound, there's no reason for that. I mean, with the right kind of parameter mapping or function you deploy, or what Macabre calls intelligent instruments, interpret data in lots of interesting ways, I could get any event or any sound of any kind from that gesture. And it could change every time I do it. The potential for repurposing data maybe means that there's a fundamental problem in the idea of agency in this interactive musical world. Okay, so there's a contradiction. The things which are of most interest in the participant's perspective, the defining aspects of the music, are the most opaque to the listener, arguably. Most opaque to the aesthetic level. We don't necessarily know what's going on. This is, I suppose, I'm finding this in the idea that the performance is about empathy. And that Herzl uses the term intersubjectivity to describe that idea that we can understand someone else's actions by, as it were, transplanting ourselves inside them. And so when we see a virtuoso flautist, we're impressed by virtue of the contrast between ourselves in that position and what we're actually witnessing. And that's what we're deprived of in interactive music. So, how could we analyse what's going on in these processes which take no account of what the participants said, or take no account of our knowledge of a design of an object or a particular system which maps parameters in a certain way? Well, there are examples. There's Paul Berliner's work on jazz, and earlier examples in jazz theory where, again, the analytical method really doesn't take any account of what the jazz musicians said they did or why. I think that one of the most famous examples is Gunther Schuller's work on Sonny Rollins, where he he took some transcriptions of Rollins' solos, or in fact one particular solo, Blues 7, and he looked at motivic organisation in this solo, without asking Rollins in advance whether that's how he thought of this solo. He just put it through a kind of the mill, as it were, as if it was a Mozart string quartet, where the motives, how they're being developed, where the transpositions, where the inversions. And he wrote a very convincing article showing how this solo was apparently constructed in this way. But there was none of that kind of ethnographic approach you might expect in more recent times that Paul Berliner works with, where you actually ask the person what they thought they were doing. So, but it is a potential possibility that we simply take the work at face value and we apply models based on our own expectations of what music, how it can be organised, and see whether it works. An example of this is Jeff Pressing's theory about how improvised music works. An example which takes us beyond just that is Pressing's work on how improvisation works, where he's trying to, I think, bridge that gap. He's, from his own perspective as an improviser, theorising about how improvisation works from the point of view of the improviser, but also, therefore, how we can perceive that process in terms of structure without knowing what the person is thinking. So he sees this process of generation, development, evaluation in time as a series of non-overlapping events, which he calls E, E1, then E2. It's a little bit reminiscent of moment form. The music is made up of these independent sections. The reason they're not entirely independent is because he has a theory of how they relate in terms of recollection or memory, M for memory, and R, a reference, some kind of outside goal or external aim. So he says that this is on the right-hand kind of equation, but that's what it is. E, an event, a section of music, leads to EI+1 in terms of the accumulating memory of previous E's and our desires, aims, beliefs, whatever you want to call them, the reference that formulate that. And he talked about objects, features and processes, by which he means musical sound events, parameters of those, processes by which one might relate to another. We're very much kind of looking at the musical objects as they could be transcribed in improvisation, as a way of seeing that kind of process of unfolding events actually taking place. And there is an article where he applies this to test improvisations. Okay, moving swiftly on. So one way of maybe addressing the tension between these two areas is to think, well, could we look, if we know that interactive music is a learning experience or transactions, are they detectable in this way? Can we look through evidence just simply in the sound, just as Schuller looked at evidence in the Rollins solo, for these procedures actually underway, without actually having to ask anyone what they thought was happening? Okay, very swiftly then. Live algorithms compounds these problems. Live algorithms is takes the idea of generative music and the idea of interactive music together as a whole, and raising the question of whether computers and musicians can work on the same level, whether generative procedures become such that they can be interacted with, just as if you were interacting with another person. Interesting question then, when would we know that was happening? Well, we worked in free improvisation. How is it heard? I'll skip over that. We had a test, one concert with the Live Algorithms Network, that's George Lewis and Evan Parker, where on the left photo, they actually went through a series of tests with improvising systems, not knowing what was going to go, not knowing anything about any of those systems. There were 4, I think, in total, and simply played with them. So in a public concert. And so the experience was all about trying to monitor their apprehension of the process purely through music, purely through that idea of ideas transferred through sound. I'm going to just skip over metaphors. So as that domain becomes more complex, we are having to resort to metaphors. And again, we can turn to jazz analysis as an example. I mentioned Paul Berliner. The way he understands the way that interacting participants work in a group, in the case of the Miles Davis Quintet, is he transcribes the whole, and then, if you like, he draws arrows of connections, if you like, the R and the M, evidence of the R and the M in pressings terms between. Herbie Hancock does this, and then the drummer does this. And we can see a chain, a pattern. Although he doesn't use pressings language, that's implicitly what he's doing. He's looking for objects which are evidences of memory and connection. So, implicit in that is that the music itself embodies the social intention. I do this, I expect something to happen from somewhere else in the group. Now, could we accept that as a metaphor, and if we listen to interactive, generative music, can we pretend, as it were, it's a social practice? Can we hear sonic events as if they are evidence of social engagement? Now, okay, I'll skip that. That arguably is making the flaw that David Deutsch talks about, the flaw in the Turing system, is Turing test, is that it's total behaviorism. We're just accepting everything at face value. Behavior is a form of instrumentalism. Behavior, we don't have to understand what's going on. We simply receive the behavior and interpret it according to our expectations. That's okay for some. It's not okay for David Deutsch. But it is an interesting model of how we can understand the kind of process that were underway in an event such as this. Okay, so is it all just theory or is it practice? Well, we need the analytical tools to tell us. We need to be able to interrogate the sound recorded, documented, transcribed in whatever form is appropriate, whether it's conventional notation or other ways. Can it tell us whether any of these theoretical ideas really do bear out? Because there's a lack of real hard evidence. There's an awful lot of theory, which I've just been espousing as well, and not very much real evidence. So this is really, I think, is a task which we're crying out for. Thank you. There's a paper about this.
We have time for questions. Simon, would you like to set up while we take any questions? I should say you will see this afternoon, Michael, that our conversation by email has had an effect on what Lee and I wrote for this afternoon.
Okay.
I'll refrain from saying more. Questions for Michael?
I guess the inevitable one would be, you've taken a very clear stance, Michael, one that I very much appreciate, that if you're going to take the constructive element on one side and the listening, reception elements on the other, why would they listen to a generative algorithm? But if you take that out of the equation, how does one create a theory, a philosophy, a dramaturgy of the use of something as specific and multifarious as a generative algorithm if it's not part of the listening? Inevitably it is. So I'm trying to see whether there's something from the black or the white box there that you're actually acknowledging.
If I understand you, I think yes. I mean, it does come down to specifics of them, doesn't it? There are systems which are innately of a white box type. We can perceive them. We could actually bring Fred Little into this, couldn't we? We could talk about listening grammar and compositional grammar. We could say that the system is so clearly explicit in its oral consequences that we can't really talk about the system and the sound. They are actually one and the same.
Often they're not.
Often they're not. When even Brian Eno, when he talks about music for airports, he talks about the delight of putting these different loops together, and something wonderful happens that he didn't intend, these coincidences. And of course, all that happens at such a slow rate that you have to listen for quite a while. But you can cotton on, it's there. It's there to be heard. Whereas in lexicon sonata, is it really there to be heard? Just as if, could you say, there's an artist going to Poisson functions. You'd never say that, unless you'd read the most rigorous analysis of it. So,
and yet it's in the program note, and then people think, what am I to listen for?
Yeah.
I think in that lies the big question.
Yeah.
What are they to listen for?
Yeah. But I think that's where Fred Little, I mean, we don't necessarily like his criticisms of the Martin Sonata, but he has a point in the criticism that there is this complex system that enables this work, which is beyond our, was beyond our cognizance. It's still beyond our oral comprehension in the most part. So, but doesn't stop us enjoying the music, so we're constructing our own listening grammar, where we're constructing a way to appreciate it. And maybe that's what we need to do with generative music. We have to find a way of appreciating this music. It's inviting us to, challenging us to do that.
I like that.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.